Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update for the 26th of May 2024. A little bit earlier today, I had to get up to do a bit of mapping. Actually, I'm a bit behind on the mapping, and for that I apologise. So I'm going to do my news piece a little bit earlier than normal. The Ukrainian General Staff figures are telling us what we've seen over the last few weeks, although there has been a downtick over the last 2 or 3 days, as I think things have settled down somewhat in the northern area, in that Kharkiv direction where the Russians are attacking across the border. The Ukrainians have, I think, successfully stopped the Russians there and are pushing back, and that has meant that the Russians aren't losing so many in their grinding forward attacks. There are claims that they are attacking slightly to, or going to attack slightly to the east of where they're attacking at the moment. We'll talk about that in the third section to this video. But as you can see, 1,110 Russian personnel lost, 12 tanks, 17 armoured personnel vehicles, and 24 artillery systems. That's going to be painful, but not as painful as they have been. Tanks is quite high. 12 tanks, to lose 12 tanks in a day is careless. Where are they? Under the sofa. 1 multiple launch rocket system, 31 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 7 pieces of special equipment. So not crazy high, but that consistent attrition that leads me to be somewhat hopeful for the Ukrainians going forward. And when we go to Andrew Perpetua's loss lists and the statistics, these are visually confirmed losses. We can see that the Russians have lost 3, maybe 4 times as many, probably 3.5 times as many pieces of equipment as the Ukrainians have lost. So straight away, that ratio is in Ukraine's favour, as we've seen for the last couple of days, but previously for the last sort of week. Again, that correlates to that northern attack in Kharkiv. The Russians were attriting the Ukrainian equipment on a sort of parity. I think that was largely due to Lancets being so effective in that region in taking out Ukrainian artillery pieces. As you can see, far fewer here. In fact, we've only got 1 Lancet, where I think yesterday we had, goodness knows, I don't know, was it 8 or so? A lot more. So I think, again, that tells you a story. This is why I like to look at these statistics. All stats tell you a story. It's trying to pick out what the correct story is. And I hope that my speculations are at least somewhat rational. I wouldn't necessarily include the Starlinks there, but some surveillance and comms equipment taken out for the Ukrainians, M777 and other artillery pieces, a couple of tanks, don't know what they are, they're unknown, which means that they are found on some video footage, but they are at that stage so blown up that you can't tell what tank it was. Nothing of high value there for the Ukrainians. And when I say that, of course, I'm talking comparatively. All bits of equipment are of high value for the Ukrainians, but it is not like they've lost an air defense system, a jet, so on and so forth. Okay, Russians losing a lot of surveillance and comms equipment, some engineering vehicles again. They're losing quite a few of those at the moment. And then that indicates that possibly the Ukrainians are trying to stop the Russians from building fortifications or from recovering vehicles. I was wondering about the rationale of when the Ukrainians damage, and the same could be said for the Russians, right? When the Ukrainians damage a Russian tank, you quite often see, so it gets immobilized by maybe a mine or a drone. There's surely a bit of a rationale to not hit that, to let it remain recoverable. So it's only marginally damaged. And then the Russians bring out their recovery vehicle, and that's when you hit it, and you hit both of them. So you can get the recovery vehicle as well. Where it's sometimes, I think that if you take out a vehicle so it can't move, immobilize it, and then hit it with 3 or 4 FPV drones so that you've completely gutted the tank, it's then not recoverable, which means you're not luring in. There's a kind of bait idea to get a recovery vehicle to come and try and recover a tank that's only marginally taken out and hit them both. Anyway, this is my thought. Right, there's another T90M added, a destroyed T90M. We saw 6 on yesterday's list. This is their best tank. Wow, they are losing those hand over fist at the moment. Another tracked garden shed, their Blyat Mobile, another one of those taken out. That's the tank with all the Mad Max corrugated iron and whatnot put on the top to protect it, so they can act as your vanguard troop carrier, really. And we're seeing a number of those get destroyed. Infantry fighting vehicles, a range of those, BMP 1s, 2s and 3s. Armoured personnel vehicles, trucks, and actually an awful lot of civilian vehicles there, including quite a host of motorcycles. There's a video doing the rounds of motorcycle training. So the Russians are now explicitly training on motorcycle attacks on trenches. It's that classic discussion I've been having lots with you, which is that because they have to? Ideally, motorbikes are not the best, the most optimal vehicle to be using to attack a trench system, or actually are there some advantage? Maybe it could be that the Russians can be forced to use them because their APCs and IFVs are so low on the ground, as in they've been attrited that much that they're forced to use motorcycles. But maybe actually there are some advantages to motorcycles. Very quick, more difficult to hit than an APC, so on and so forth. You can get up to the trench quick, dismount very easily, and attack the trench. So if you're attacking with 6 motorcycles, that could be more challenging than 1 APC. All right, so might be some advantages that come, but again, it is the idea that they're kind of forced to use these to find those advantages, because they are low on many of their more conventional types of vehicles. As you can see, quite a few destroyed there, as opposed to damaged, which is fairly usual for the Russian lists at the moment. Moving on though, so the Russians definitely lost a lot more than the Ukrainians and will be hurting from those losses, I think, more. When we talk about the general staff figures for personnel losses and wondering how accurate they are, remember yesterday we brought into play the British Defence Journal, UK Defence Journal, that stated that they thought 450,000 had been killed or injured or abducted, POWs or deserted. So that's only 50,000. I mean, it sounds like a lot, but actually, really, relatively speaking, that's fairly close to what the general staff have been saying. And then we bring together all these data points to say, oh, yep, okay, it seems like the Russians are certainly losing a lot, and the general staff figures don't seem that fanciful. And then when you look at this, this is evidence of the scale of Russian casualties in Ukraine, says Trent Telenko. So Prune 60 says, quoting from, and I think this probably comes from Moscow Times, that we're going to look at in a second, demographers have linked the rise in the number of men with disabilities to the war. Quote, I think that there are actually tens of thousands, if not hundreds, of disabled military personnel. If the increase is smaller, it means they are partially or completely hidden. The demographer Alexei Raksha said about this. So Russians needed a record number of wheelchairs and prosthetic limbs. The rate at which the number has increased in 1 year is staggering, far more than can be attributed to just an aging population. So Russians need it. So that's the title of the Moscow Times piece here. We'll see if we can get this translated into English. So Moscow Times is an exiled Russian news service. Russians needed a record number of wheelchairs and prosthetic limbs. At the end of 2023, more than 466,000 disabled people are registered with the Social and Pension Insurance Fund who need wheelchairs, prostheses and other special equipment, writes Verska, which is another media source. The figure was a record for the entire period of statistics since 2012. Before the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the number of people who require rehabilitation equipment increased by no more than 7%, from 307,000 to 331,000. Last year, it increased by 42%, namely by 137,000 people. So in 1 year, that very, I guess, your more serious end of the disability spectrum in terms of physical disability increased by 137,000, which is a huge amount and much more than we had seen previously. The number of Russians with disabilities who require wheelchairs increased by 81,000, up to 292,400 people. The number of those in need of chairs with sanitary equipment has also increased from 66.5 thousand to 101.6 thousand, and 72,300 Russians will need prostheses. Over the past year, the number of registered disabled people who need special clothing has increased significantly. So all of these numbers going up and up and up. In 2022, there were 1.67 million people with disabilities. in the 31 to 59-year-old age category. Now there's 2.17 million people, which is a record in that category. So the growth over the year was 30%, 507,000 people in 1 year. In 2020, the number was 2 million people. In 2016, when the data was first published, 1.97 million people. Just so on. So in addition, in 2023, there were 290,000 men with disabilities aged 18 to 30. My goodness, just an awful lot of disabled people. Goodness. Demographers have linked the increase to the number of people with disabilities. They've linked that to the war, as mentioned. Since the beginning of the war, the Russian army has lost about 500,000 people, according to the British Ministry of Defence. So that's that 450,000 that we talked about yesterday. Leo Doherty, the Under Secretary of Defence for the Armed Forces, said in late April that it had lost about 450,000 people killed and wounded, and tens of thousands had deserted. This is again another data point that points to the reality in Russia that they have lost an awful lot of people as a result of this war. Many dead, and many injured to the point of severe disability that would invalidate them from fighting again. Meanwhile, back in Ukraine, another Su-25 was shot down yesterday by the 110th Mechanized Brigade. They are doing a good job of shooting these down. As Noel report says, let's hope for some confirmation. Well, that did actually come out. Russian Su-25 attack aircraft burns up in the steppes in the Ukrainian Donbass. Ukrainian armed forces confirmed the downing of the plane. Soldiers from the 110th published a video of the work of their anti-aircraft fighters. This is already the 8th Su-25 lost on the account of fighters from the 110th. As I said, they are doing really good job there. Named after Colonel General Mark Bezruchka. That's who they are. Anyway, good stuff there, because these are going to help deliver those aerial menaces, those guided glide bombs. Right, as I show you the next couple of videos, or reference them, because I can't really show you the whole videos, I get in trouble. Again, it's what do these tell you? Here is a column of vehicles that is, as claimed here, a Russian mechanized assault is completely annihilated. The defense is carried out by the soldiers of the 54th. It's trying to work out what's taking these vehicles out. I think it's a mixture of mines, ATGMs, trying to work out whether there is whether artillery is doing a lot of the work here as well, and if so, that is good news for the Ukrainians. We'll come on to talk about artillery, or that might be in the next video actually. But this is just a whole column that's annihilated, and then when we go back to look at these figures and say, well, is that realistic that they're losing 12 tanks, 17 APVs? Well, that's one attack, and I lost a whole bunch in that one. So yeah, it is somewhat realistic. Right, this is another video that I can't show you. This is a T90, so we talked about that T90. It probably is a T90 on the list actually. This was hit in the rear by something, by a drone, I think. And then what's interesting is that immobilizes the tank, and it stops, careers off the road, and then stops. And then what's interesting is the second drone that comes along, and the drone, obviously the drone operators know what they're doing. So you've got this little drone here. Let's make that a little bit bigger for you. So you've got the drone that comes in here, and it hovers around and then just waits to get its sights exactly. And then it hits in this area between the turret and the chassis. That is the weak spot on these tanks. And this tank, that's the end of this tank. I mean, it appears to cook off some of the ammunition or something around here, and it's all burning around the turret of the tank and through the top. There you go, typical. Didn't quite get it right. Of course, there's some music. And yeah, it's just the accuracy of these drone operators leading to not just the immobilization of tanks, but taking them completely out. That tank will not be used again, one would think. I'm sure the inside is just completely wrecked. Now, moving on to Russia on fire instances. There was a big fire in Moscow yesterday in Podolsk. A warehouse is said to be on fire with exploding gas cylinders, exacerbating the problem. Was it sabotage, smoking, drones, incompetence? Probably the latter, to be honest, says Tim White. That said, it did cause quite a bit of consternation. A massive fire broke out in a warehouse with gas cylinders in Moscow region, says Nexta. The emergencies Ministry for Moscow region claims that the fire that covered an area of more than 500 square meters was extinguished with no victims. At the same time, Russian media say that locals reported hearing some explosions before the fire in the warehouse, although the online footage shows that the smoke column was quite high and was allegedly visible several kilometers from the scene. Russian emergency officials deny that the fire was large scale. So could have been a strike by drones, could have been some sabotage, or it just could have been careless smokers. Don't know, but there was a fairly sizable fire in Moscow. Right. Last night, there was I don't know whether to call it a big attack, a big strike. I've been saying we are long overdue, Ukraine are long overdue, a Russian strike using missiles and drones. And last night, we got a strike using missiles and drones. But what's interesting is that there were 31 Shaheeds, which is fairly standard. It's not a huge amount. We have seen, in fact, let's look at our Dell's list of or Dell's representation of the data. This is the general staff data. We are going to look at cruise missiles. So cruise missiles, 88 was the most that we've seen. And as you can see there, the last big one was the beginning of May, I think. And you had just over 40 missiles used then. When we look at drones, we look at the most used were 93. And then the last big one was 81 by the looks of it. So you're thinking, okay, they can use a lot more drones and missiles, or they have used a lot more drones and missiles. Here they've used 31 Shaheeds, so that is well off the 93 drones. So that's 93. So goodness me, that's like a third. Literally exactly a third of what they have used previously in large attacks. And 14 cruise missiles. 14 cruise missiles compared to the largest number of cruise missiles was 88. 14. And even like recently, just over 40 were used. It's a third, it's a quarter of what they have used. I mean, what is going on here? Because like I was expecting like a really big attack. Now, are they going to do something like this on consecutive nights? So it could be that tonight there's one similar to this, and then the night after. So it could be like, instead of all at once, 3 nights of the same. But then you're giving air defenses a chance to reset and get their interceptor missiles in place for the next barrage. Whereas if you did it all at once, you would properly overcome the air defense system. So I think this is suboptimal. And if they're only able to use 12 cruise missiles and 2 Kinzhals, which are the hypersonic Dagger missiles, I after expecting there to be a massive barrage, I don't know. I think this is not good news for Russia. But I could be trying to be too optimistic here. But I look at this and go, yeah, I was expecting a massive barrage, and that isn't a massive barrage. And the fact that Ukraine was able to take out 100% of Shaheeds and 100% of the cruise missiles means that, yeah, okay, they are finding out. It could be that this is trying to find out the best route to get through the air defenses. But I don't know. I just think that is unimpressive. And I hope that that's all they can do, and that they aren't going to do just a stupendously massive attack tonight. Now, what's also very important to note is where almost all of them were headed. Yep, there are some drones that were headed towards, looks like Poltava there. There's some drones heading up to sort of Zaporizhia up. No, it's not Zaporizhia, but further to northwest there, Mykolaiv. But actually, most were headed here. The Kinzhals were headed here, and they evidently would have struck. You've got cruise missiles headed here that were apparently taken out, and all the drones taken out. But where they're headed, well, that's Starokonstantinov in Khmelnytsky Oblast. That is the airbase where the Sukhois take off to drop the cruise missiles, fire the cruise missiles off into Russia or into occupied Ukraine. But it's likely that they are targeting this base because they think that's where the F-16s are coming. This is all about F-16s, I think, which again tells you a lot. They are worried about F-16s, and rightly so. And you would imagine that they are going to be targeting that base particularly going forward. I don't know whether that's where the F-16s are definitely going to be housed, and in fact they are unlikely to put them all in one place, obviously. But there are only several places that they can use F-16s due to the needs of those planes and the types of runways they need, which is why I've been long talking about housing the F-16s in NATO countries and then just using them, shipping them across to Staro-Konstantinov just before they run a mission, pop them over from Romania to Khmelnytsky, get them fueled up and then take off from there, fueled up and maybe missiles put on them, take off from there, and then they come back, and then you then go and house them in a hangar in Romania. And interestingly, before you say, well, no, that's too dodgy, NATO, blah, 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 that is, I believe, what Russia did. Is that, and someone was telling me in the Korean War, that's exactly what Russia did. So there you go. There's form for it from the other side. Soviet Union at the time. Right, Russians have struck a busy shopping centre. So the big news from yesterday is the epicenter hypermarket in Kharkiv was hit. 200 people were inside it at the time. It's caused quite a stir internationally. It took a bit of time, and the news was a little bit slow, I think, to pick this up, mainstream media. But there were people like Emmanuel Macron coming out and talking about this. It was horrific. It was terrorism. As Konstantin, who is a Ukrainian that contributes to Andrew Perpetua's live stream, says, Russians struck at the heart of Kharkiv. Because it wasn't just that hypermarket. They also struck a couple of hours later, just down the road, in the busiest part of Kharkiv. And that is, again, terrorism. So Russians struck at the heart of Kharkiv, the most populated area of the city, which is Saltivka. These buildings that I've highlighted are 100 to 200 to 435 meters long, 12-story buildings that house 450,000 people. Lots of numbers there, but you get the point. Most of them on the weekend go to the shopping centre next to them. The mall has home improvement store that was struck, 2 very large shopping malls with movie theatre, food courts, trampoline park, hockey arena and much more. My father-in-law was 200 metres away from there as he has a small electronics store. He usually goes to the epicentre at 4 p.m, but this time he had a customer, so he stayed. That was when the strike happened. He was lucky. Unfortunately, others were not. And that is, it was an absolute shocker. So much so that the UN has come out and officially condemned the Russian strike against the Kharkiv hypermarket. Quote, intentionally directing an attack against civilian infrastructure is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law, said the UN's humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine. Now, what happens with that, what the UN do about that, I don't know, but it is not cool. Zelensky's come out and said typically strong stuff. In fact, this is a 6-minute 20 speech that he's made, or video that he's made, that I think
for them it is a pleasure to burn. We all know who are we dealing with. Russia is run by men who want to make it a norm, burning lives, destroying cities and villages, dividing people and erasing national borders through war. There is no nation that can stop such war alone. Unaided world leaders' engagement is needed. I'm now in Kharkiv, a city in the east of Ukraine, and unfortunately very close to the border on Russia. What does it mean for Kharkiv? A third year of constant terror. More than 1 million of people in this city. And every night and every day, Russian army is shelling the city, mostly with S-300 missiles. These are air defense missiles which Russia employs to terrorize the land. There is not a single district or street in the Kharkiv that hasn't suffered from this regular cruelty.
The problem is, for the Ukrainians, is that even if they had the best air defenses in the area, those S-300s are sent so close to the border, they're sent from Belgorod area, that they are around the city, and actually arguably within the confines of civilian infrastructure, that the Ukrainians don't have time, even with Patriots, to take those missiles out of the sky. They're just too quick and sent from too close. Whereas if you imagine this sort of carry on, you have a hypersonic missile coming all the way over from a long way away. You have these cruise missiles likewise. You have time to target them, acquire them as a target, and then take them out of the sky. If you're in Kharkiv and you have a missile that comes from just here, bosh. You don't have time, and so you can have all the Patriots you like, but you're still going to be unlikely to be able to take out these missiles effectively. So what you need to do is take out the things that fire those missiles, so the S-300 launchers, and that means you need to be able to hit using decent weapons, Western-provided weapons, inside Kharkiv, and that's the point. Anyway, we'll leave Zelensky there. It is worth listening to the whole thing. Rescuers extinguished the fire at the epicenter. 12 people died, 43 were injured, 16 people are still considered missing. And some devastating imagery coming out from there. Now, there was a big attack on Belgorod just after that, where the governor claimed 4 civilians died. Tim White says, in what smacks of a distraction technique to cover the crimes in Kharkiv, the Kremlin suddenly claims Ukraine fired a Neptune anti-ship missile as well as 29 Vampire rockets, which were all shot down. These claims are bizarre because Vampire rockets, I think, are unlikely to be able to reach Belgorod anyway. So they often do this, and this looks very convenient. Or it could be that Ukraine are trying to shoot down or destroy the SAM launchers that are perhaps set up, as mentioned, within the civilian infrastructure. And this is, what the Russians do to protect their launchers, arguably. I don't know. So, and then there was Chernihiv was also hit yesterday, as well as Kharkiv. The regions were hit by Russian missile strikes, supposedly Iskander-Ms. It's unknown what the targets were at the current time of those images, and that was, as mentioned, including Chernihiv, so further along the border. Skadovsk was hit, and that is a place I talked about that only yesterday, about how there were hotels there where it's on the seaside where the Russians have set up shop for some of their officers. Has been hit over the course. Many places like that along the coast have been hit over the course of the war. This is one of the places where the Russians retreated to after Kherson itself was liberated, and they moved a lot of their stuff back to Skadovsk, and it has been routinely hit by, I think, cruise missiles and all sorts there. So Skadovsk, I don't know what was hit yesterday, but anyway, it was targeted by the Ukrainians. But not too much news of any other major strikes from the Ukrainians at all. Now we're going to go on to other bits and pieces and some general discussion. Russia, this is Andrew Perpetua, and take it for what it is, but I find this interesting because he's basically saying exactly what I've been saying. This is in answer to Rob Lee, who said, look, Russia currently has the initiative and several advantages on the battlefield. Western ammunition production capacity is increasing, which will reduce some of these advantages next year. Russia's minimum goal is to capture the rest of the Donbass, and I'm sceptical that Russia would pursue a ceasefire this year as long as it believes it can make further gains on the battlefield. So there's the idea that Russia is looking to make those gains. It won't really seriously go for negotiations. Andrew Perpetua says, and this is kind of how I feel, but I wonder whether I'm too positive. Russia is running full, and by the way, this is coming from someone who is very used to some people accuse him of dooming on his live streams. He's very realistic about Ukraine's chances. He is very critical of Zelensky. He's very critical of decisions that have been made. This is the sort of guy who will not paint things up into a pretty picture of what's going on. So for him to say this, I think is pretty interesting. So Russia is running full speed into a brick wall. They are going to face massive problems going forward, and they are running out of time. Wanting to freeze the war is only natural when you're in that position, especially when you've duped a lot of the world into thinking you're doing well. This is what I've been saying, like, and I get it. A lot of Ukrainians are going to feel like it's all terrible for them, that they are on their knees. But that's why I keep trying to give you that macro view as well as a micro view. Yeah, here are some things blowing up. Here's some moves on the front line. This is where the Russians are doing well. This is where the Ukrainians are doing well. This is what blah, blah, blah. And then you might look at that and go, oh, it's all terrible. But then you need that macro view of like, and this is what's happening with the Russian economy. And this is what's happening with the Ukrainian economy. This is what's happening with the rest of the allied nations doing this. It's not enough, but actually it puts Ukraine in a better place going forward than Russia will be, because Russia is operating at max at the moment. It needs not only a shed load of equipment to replace all the stuff that we're seeing is lost on a daily basis, but it also needs a lot of people. It needs to nationally mobilize. It can't even take Chasiv Yar at the moment with all its military force and might. And if you think that they are doing well, just get a sense of the well that they are doing is taking places like Novomykhailivka, but taking them and losing 320 pieces of mechanized equipment to take this small town, to take this almost village, right? Small town of Novomykhailivka. How much did they lose in taking Bakhmut? How much have they lost in taking Avdiivka? Avdiivka was one of the low points for Ukraine in this whole war. You can go back to Popasna and other moments, but when we've really been focusing on losses and whatnot, Avdiivka, they lost well over 1,000 pieces of kit to take Avdiivka, and that was mainly due to their aviation that they were able to do that. And if their aviation at the moment is getting taken down more because the Ukrainians have got more man-pads, the man-portable air defense systems, but also short-range air defense systems in position and more equipment coming through, that will stop the Russians being able to use that aviation as effectively. And if we can do that up in the north as well, that's really significant. Then the F-16s come in, and the idea is you look at the macro picture and you're thinking, actually, I think the prognosis for the Ukrainians is good going forward, or it certainly is better than the Russians. And the Russians are hitting their head against a brick wall. I agree with Andrew Perpetua here, and I'm surprised he's saying so overtly that. And he actually, the elements of what he's been saying over time, by looking again at the open source satellite imagery that's available of, say, the stockpiles, so the howitzer stockpiles, the BTR stockpiles, the BMDs. Look at all of these bits of equipment and how they're stored in Russia, and they're dwindling. They're just using them all up, and again, that's telling you something. So if you're someone that like, oh, doom and gloom, Ukraine is losing, la 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 la, you're like, well, hang on. When we piece all these pieces of the jigsaw together, it's not great. Russia have just sacked most of the upper hierarchy of their military organization. They've moved Shoigu. Gerasimov is almost certainly going to go, surely, and everyone under Shoigu, they're all been sacked or arrested. Like, if you're arresting them all, that's just nuts. And then you get elements like this. So all eyes should be on the 58th Combined Arms Army over the next few days. They are reportedly refusing orders right now due to their commander being arrested. And you've got Teplinsky down in that area, not doing very well in the Krinky area. You've got all sorts of, you've got problems everywhere you look with the way Russia are doing things. You've got problems with their economy. You've got companies pulling out. You've got China, although they're helping Ukraine a lot, they're also having secondary sanctions being put on them by the US, and that is affecting their ability to support Russia. Meanwhile, everyone else in the world is still fine with supporting Ukraine. We're not being sanctioned. So there is this asymmetry there where the future for Russia is only anything like difficult. There's every which way you look at how Russia needs to succeed here, there are obstacles and obstacles and obstacles. If they do a national mobilization, that gives them a fighting chance of obtaining their maximalist goals. But in doing a national mobilization, you will cause the economy to absolutely free fall tank, and it will be insanely unpopular. And that's when you're starting to have issues at home politically. So that's why he hasn't done it. Like I say, and I say this with the missiles, you would if you could. You aren't, so you can't. Right? So with the missiles, if you could fire 100 missiles in last night, if you could have done that, you would have done that. Because 14 missiles is not as good as 100 missiles. What are you going to overcome the enemy air defenses with? More missiles. So you didn't do that, which means you can't do that. And even if you're saving it, we could, but we're saving them for tomorrow or 3 days' time. Well, you can't. It means you can't do both. Like if you can't shoot 100 missiles then and 100 missiles over there, it means that you can't do. If you're not doing that, you can't do it, right? So I think the Russians are in a bit of trouble with the production of missiles and drones. Otherwise, we just would have seen more, like we've seen previously. And if they aren't mobilizing, it's because they can't, or they kind of physically can, but politically and economically they can't. And that's the problem they're in. I mean, it's been the same for the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians have got a bit of elbow room because they've got the prison population they can dip into, which the Russians have already done that. The Russians are going abroad, prison population anywhere, but trying to mobilize those people from St. Petersburg and Moscow and all around that will cause that economic collapse. The Ukrainians still have some elbow room, but there's a big difference between mobilization between the countries as well. So when you look at, you have these moral evaluations of people getting rounded up into vans and taken away. But actually, in fact, I think, do we have this here to talk about, or have I got that? No, I think I've got that for the military aid. So they are starting to round people up in Moscow, apparently. There are some mothers and family members following these buses around the picking up people and protesting about it. And you look at that and go, it's terrible, rounding people up and putting into a van. And then you look at the Ukrainians do that, and some people go, that's terrible. But I have to explain, no, it's the law in Ukraine, as it might be in Russia. But let me explain the difference. So when you have a law saying you have been selected to be drafted into the armed forces, by not turning up, you're breaking a law. And if you're a criminal, say a thief or a burglar, a murderer, right? If you're walking down the street and you've escaped being rounded, the police haven't so far arrested you, you would be expected to be captured by the police, have your hands handcuffed and thrown into the back of a van for breaking the law, right? Draft evasion is the same. So that is the law of the land. And if you haven't done that, then you can expect, it's not like you're going to walk down the street and the police or the recruiters are going to go, oh, we've got you on a list. Can you turn up to the recruitment officers, please? Even though this person's been evading for a year. They're not going to go, oh, yeah, sure. I'm just on the way to the bank at the moment. I'll go tomorrow morning at 9:30. Oh yeah, no worries. That's not going to happen. So here's a draft evader. They're breaking the law. We ran them up and put them in a van, right? But you look at these two things from the Russians doing that and the Ukrainians doing that, and you think, well, it's the same. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. It's not. Like, the Russians are forcing their people into vans to send them to a war of aggression where they've invaded another country that is not necessary for them to do. So if Russia pulled out of Ukraine now, Russia would still exist as a country, right? Whereas if Ukraine doesn't defend itself, it will cease to exist as a country. It will be subsumed by Russia, right? So this is existential and therefore necessary for Ukraine to mobilize its troops to defend itself from ceasing existing. It is not necessary for Russia to mobilize its troops to do what they're doing. This is not a necessary thing. This is almost, and I use this word very pointedly, it's almost frivolous. This is the desires of someone who wants to be Peter the Great too, right? This is Vladimir Putin as a dictator saying, you are all going to die for my weird objectives in Ukraine that completely are not necessary. We didn't need to do this and we weren't doing it. Everyone's surprised that we did it because it's so bonkers and self-serving, but we did it. And I'm going to round you up off the streets and send you to your deaths over there. She's different too. We need to defend ourselves. Please, we're going to take you and use you defensively because it's necessary for our very existence. Anyway, Rick from Ukraine has something to say about... no, he's not Rick from Ukraine. That's Rick from Ukraine. This is Rick from the Netherlands. Has something to say about how the Dutch are reporting things, and I think this is worthy of note. Hi, Jonathan. Thanks so much for the update. Great work. Listening to your train of thoughts gives me hope. When I read and talk with some Dutch people, they either do not care about the war They think Russia and Ukraine should start negotiations because that would be the only way to end the war and prevent further deaths, or even worse, they blame the West for the war in Ukraine and think that because of supporting Ukraine, we needlessly stretch the war, as if Putin would stop if Ukraine runs out of weapons. It really affects me on a personal level. Even the Dutch news seems to emphasize the impossible job Ukraine stands for. The West is sending weapons, but who is going to use them? The NOS also put out an article, so this is a Dutch media site, with the Washington Post as a source, quote, Russian jamming leaves some high-tech US weapons ineffective in Ukraine. I hate how inaccurate titles can be. The article even includes HIMARS. We do not read about successful strikes on high-priority targets such as S-300, S-400 systems and all those airframes. At the end of the Dutch version of the article of the Washington Post, and it states, used Google Translate for this quote, for this part, a senior US military official says disruptions have been factored in from the outset and that the military is continuously working with Ukraine to respond to them. But according to the security expert, Russia is always outsmarting Western countries. That's one heck of a message to take home. Again, what about all those successful strikes? No, Russia is always outsmarting us. Sorry for my rant. I just find it so incredibly difficult to deal with injustice. This is why I'm here doing what I do. This is all about my burning sense of injustice. Even though I realise I'm just another idiot that thinks he knows a bit more than what is true, about what is true than those other idiots. And I get that. I totally get that. And it's really frustrating the way everything is couched. And I talked about this over the last week, that the mainstream media will report about how terrible it is that the Russians have been have invaded in the Kharkiv direction, and woe is Ukraine, and oh my goodness, look at how terrible things are for Ukraine. And then 3 days later or a week later, fails to report that the Ukrainians have done a really good job in rebutting the Russians. The Russians have lost a shed load of people and equipment, and they haven't really achieved anything significant. And that's where we're at. But that's not reported. It's all about the doom and not about the success of the Ukrainians. And it's this continual cycle of doom, doom, doom. So the general sense of what's going on with this war from out there is that Russia are continually winning, continually outsmarting the Ukrainians, and therefore what's the point of us supporting the Ukrainians? We need to stop this, we need to go to negotiations. That's a general kind of sense out there, and it's inaccurate. Yes, Ukraine are up against it. Yes, they are having issues with electronic warfare, jamming, and being outsmarted in particular areas. But then it's the outsmarting the Russians, and it's this what happens in war as you have measures and countermeasures, and it's this arms race of who can outsmart the other. It's not just Russia always outsmarts Ukraine. That's not what's happening at all. You look at the strikes recently, you look at the 3 S-400, S-300 batteries that have been taken out. That massive degradation of the Russian air defences. You look at those 2 huge strikes in 3 nights of 100 plus drones slamming into Russian targets and the sinking of 1 ship. Right? How much is that reported by the mainstream media? So I get this, mate. I really, really do. Now, German intelligence warns of Ukraine facing larger territorial losses by the end of the year due to Russian superiority, citing artillery dominance and mobilization issues. I'd be interested to read that source material, actually, because I think there are mobilization issues, but I think that's for both sides. And the artillery dominance is not what it was. And there is, I've got that in my military aid video, but there is a Sky News reporter that's done a piece on the ground with some Ukrainians saying that they've got a 5-1 artillery dominance, which is bad, but interestingly not as bad as it used to be. And also, although you might even argue, okay, the ratio is broadly the same as it used to be, but the real numbers are actually much, much lower. So what I mean is that at the beginning of the war, the height of the war, the Russians were using 40 to 60,000 shells a day. They're now just about getting away with 10,000 shells a day. So they're at least a quarter, maybe a sixth of what they were firing. Well, that ratio might be the same as you go down. Actually, the ratio's got slightly better for the Ukrainians if it is 5-1, because at that stage, like if it was 60,000, Ukrainians, I think at that stage were like 7,000 at the most. And so that ratio has improved and the real numbers have come right down. And then I think in that article, it says the Russians are outproducing the Ukrainians at 3-1. Well, if going forward it's 3-1, and that's and it's like, woe are the Ukrainians, they are being outproduced 3-1 in artillery, that's a massive improvement. It's about understanding the context of the whole war and the narrative through the whole war. It's not just looking at that and going, oh, they're at 3-1, oh, bleh, woe is the Ukrainians, let's just give up. That's an incredible improvement of the Western ramping up. It's not quick enough. Yeah, that's a problem. Like 2 years in and we're starting to see this happen. But a 3-1 manufacturing advantage, and then I'm wondering, does that take into account the Czech initiative of buying, the Estonian initiative, the potential drawdown? So, there's a lot more behind this that needs to be discussed, I think. What does it mean, artillery dominance? Oh, you're going to lose lots more land by the end of the year. Well, actually, the Russians are grinding to a halt now, and they need mobilization. Like, if the Russians mobilize, then maybe. I don't know. Again, I'm possibly being too positive. Zelensky says Russia is preparing to make another offensive attempt. Quote, near our border, Russia is assembling another grouping of troops and is preparing to attempt offensives 90 kilometers from Kharkiv in the northwest, the president said. So that's going in maybe the Sumy direction. But it could also mean this. So this came from a report from Ukraine, although northwest is the other direction. In the northeast, there could be... So report from Ukraine talks about how there's this reservoir and a river, and the Russians have already blown up one bridge. The first bridge is too close to be used anyway, and they've just blown up another bridge that goes across the beginning of the reservoir. And it means the Ukrainians now have to come all the way to the south of that reservoir, which adds another 50 kilometers to the journey. And that makes it much less efficient, so on and so forth. And if the Russians, so the idea is that the Russians could then attack on the more easterly end of their eastern salient. So there are these two attack vectors where the Russians are pushing across the border, although they're being pushed back at the moment. But it could be that they have shaped the battlefield to be able to do an attack to the east, and it would mean that the Ukrainians can't easily defend there because they can't get across the river, and they have to go around the whole reservoir and much further to the south to this bridge that is still standing. So anyway, but they're talking about, Zelensky's talking about the northwest, so it could be in the Sumy direction. Now, another point to note out is that more than 2,000 Ukrainian children went missing during the war. This has been reported by the Ukrainian Parliamentary Commissioner for Human Rights, Dmytro Lubinets. Illegal deportations, kidnapping of children by Russians, chaos going on in the temporarily occupied territories. Today, 2021 children are considered missing as a result of Russia's war against Ukraine. That's a much lower number than we've seen previously, but I don't know if previously there are different ways of adding these up. There are these filtration. There are ones that you just don't know where they are, that have been kidnapped, and ones that you kind of do know where they are, but they have been taken across the border. They've got filtration camps, they've got adults, they've got adolescents. So, you've got a lot of people that were children, now adults. And so there's all sorts of stats going on. But suffice to say that a lot of people have been effectively kidnapped, stolen from Ukraine and taken to Russia for brainwashing. And however many it is, it's too many. And it is illegal and it is not acceptable. SpaceX is considering Russia's attempts to jam Starlink, Elon Musk says. So according to him, this is a complex problem. The company spends significant resources to combat Russian jamming attempts. The Russians managed to turn off all communication systems except Starlink. So this is Elon Musk saying the right thing here, and SpaceX doing the right thing. Whether he's doing it because it's economically necessary for him to do it rather than in line with his political views, I don't know. Starlink are heavily contracted now to the Department of Defense, and they've created a separate military arm in SpaceX, which is probably dealing with all this, and that will obviously be in line with the American military strategizing, and so Elon Musk will be contractually obliged to be doing stuff like this, rather than trying to help out the Ukrainians because that's what he sees is the right thing to do. I think that there's a lot more going on here. But nonetheless, let's not criticize unnecessarily. This is what the Ukrainians need. They need SpaceX to be on their side, working hard to stop Russian jamming of Ukrainian equipment and indeed SpaceX equipment. Right, thank you for watching. Please subscribe, and share. Take care, and I'll speak to you later. Toodle pips.